our clay mixing facility. So as I walk into the building inside the kiln room in ceramics, I'm going to move into the raw material room, the dry material room, and in this room is a collection of 50-pound bags basically. And these 50-pound bags contain the clays that are going to be in your clay body recipe. And so I'm just going to go around the room and identify the clay. In the first case here, this is Custer feldspar, and I'll talk about what that is in a later demo. Moving this way is the OM4 ball clay. There's a label above the bags. And if you look close enough on the side of the bag, the front of the bag, or at some point, you will see the name of the clay. Moving this way, we have the gold art, and it's in these gold bags, yellow bags. And then we have the fire clay. In this case, we have Hawthorne bonfire clay, as well as a supply of the Cedar Heights fire clay. They are interchangeable, they're basically the same. So the brown bags with the blue labels, that's the Hawthorne bonfire clay. And this is the Cedar Heights fire clay. Going around the room, there's other specialty clays. Back in the corner is a Grolleg clay. That's a pure white porcelain clay. We have a specialty ball clay here. We have a tile 6 ball clay. A tile 6 kaolin clay, another white burning clay. And we have another white burning clay called EPK. And we have silica, and we have pyrax, and we have grog. And they're all labeled above the bags. Now to go back to the beginning, the feldspar is used in almost any clay body that we used at a percentage of about 10 to 15%. And this feldspar is a ground up mineral that is not a clay. It's not plastic like clay, but it has the similar ingredients that clay has. And when the ceramic piece is fired, this feldspar acts as a powerful glue that connects these particles of clay together to make the clay extra tough once it comes out of a kiln. It builds up certain kinds of crystals called mullite that increase the strength of the clay body. The ball clay is what we call a secondary clay, and it's mined in a way, it's mined and it's pulverized, and it's extremely plastic. That means it's very pliable, and we add that to the clay body to extend the workability of the clay so it doesn't crack while you're working with it. It has drawbacks in that if you add too much of it, it will cause your clay body to crack more, warp more, and shrink more. So by adding about 1/3 of this, it's a perfect mix in our clay body. Moving over here to the gold art, that's a standard stoneware clay body, and it's in between a ball clay and a fire clay. It's plastic, it adds refractory strength, which means heat in the kiln, and it has good workability. When we move over here, and that's about 1/3 of the stoneware clay body. When we move over here, we're looking at the fire clays, and these fire clays have good workability, but they also have a lot of strength in building. They help the building characteristics. They help the walls of the pot stand up, or of the sculpture stand up. And it's also more refractory than the other clays in that it doesn't melt as much. So it cuts down on warpage. And because of its particle distribution, it just makes the clay body better to work with. So in the combination of these 3 clays plus the feldspar is the foundation of our basic clay body. These specialty clays are involved with making porcelain and other kinds of clay body recipes. So as you walk into the room, the clay's on the left side, you would need further training to know about those, and I'll talk about them in my clay lecture. Okay, this is the area where we mix the clay, and there's a few things that need to be identified. In the previous video, we talked about the raw material room and the clays that are in there. In this room, which is part of the larger kiln room, you can see the kilns and the pots. In this room, we have a clay mixer. It's a Solner clay mixer, and I'm going to show you how that works in a minute. And we also have barrels of slop, or reclaim. So this reclaim is clay that has been made and worked by students or one of the instructors, any of the instructors. It's a community batch of clay that currently has too much water in it. And so what happened is that a piece dried out, and then it was put into this barrel, and you can see the water on top here. Or a student was throwing on the potter's wheel, for example, and they had a bucket full of slop, wasted clay that wasn't part of their piece that they were throwing, it was the extra. It all goes into these community barrels of slop. So once these barrels have a certain amount in them, then we grab the clay out of the barrel and put them into 5-gallon buckets, move them over to the clay mixer. And that's how we recycle clay. Now that extra wet slop or reclaim is going to get dumped right in here, and you could see a small amount of it down at the bottom of the mixer now. So I'll be adding more slop on top of this. And when I get enough slop in there, which is going to be 10 gallons of slop, and I'll be using these 5-gallon buckets, I will fill them up with slop and put them into the mixer. The 2 buckets will equal 10 gallons. Now these buckets get extremely heavy when you put the slop into them. They're much heavier than when they're full of water. So you might only want to do a half of a bucket and then lift it and put it into the mixer, and then do that 4 times to get your 10 gallons. Don't pick up things that are heavier than you can handle. The clay bags are in 50-pound bags. All these bags weigh 50 pounds. If you are not capable of picking up a 50-pound bag, you need to do it with a partner, and the partner will help you. 2 people can usually handle one of these bags. You'll be moving these bags out to the mixer because you're going to need to add the powder in these bags to the slop to make a batch of clay. So the clay that's in the slop is already a combination, the right combination of these clay materials that are in the clay room. We're just going to add more dry powder to them in the mixer so that the clay becomes the right consistency to throw pots or to build sculpture with. So going back here to how this process works. So the clay mixer will now have the 10 gallons of slop inside of it. And then it's time to turn the mixer on and turn the fan on. So you're going to be dealing with these dry powders, and they make an incredible amount of dust, and the dust that they make is silica. And silica is a material that you don't want to be breathing into your lungs. You don't want to be breathing any particles into your lungs. So you will be wearing some type of protection, an N95 or better respirator when you make the clay. And there's some basic instructions on the wall here that you need to pay attention to. So let's start with the right. Wear your respirator, turn on the exhaust fan, use a scoop to add the dry mix. Never put hands in the mixer. Do not slam the mixer lid. If the mixer is making an odd noise, you need to tell me or another professor or grad student. And then this is more about cleanup. Okay, here are the exhaust fans. And it's counterintuitive here. There's two exhaust fans. One works a kiln at the opposite side of this room, and one works the clay mixer. And so the problem is the fan that works the clay mixer is the furthest away from the clay mixer. This is it right here. And so what you need to do here is turn the mixer to the on position. Now here, this giant fan is above the mixer, come on, and it's going to be sucking air from the room on the outside of the doors open, up into that fan, so that most of the dust exits that way and doesn't flow through. So you must be using the fan. Turning the fan off now because it's so loud. Now let's look at the mixer. The mixer is a concrete barrel inside of a steel frame, and that barrel rotates because there's a large sprocket with a chain on it down below here. There's the chain. And it's connected to a very powerful motor in the back. That's connected to a box that has an on and an off switch up here at the top. And you can't see those very well from your position in front of the mixer. The box is sort of turned away, and that's because of how it's set up with the lid safety. So I can't push any of the buttons on the mixer, because if I do, it won't come on because the lid is open. So the first thing I have to do if I want to turn the mixer on is close the lid. The next thing I have to do is reach my hand around onto this box and feel the first button. The top button is the on button. Push that button. That turns the barrel, and that begins to mix the clay. Now if I lift up the lid, the mixer turns on. Now, I've been using a mixer like this for 35 years, and they're in all kinds of schools all over the country. It's a Solner clay mixer, and I've never heard of anyone being hurt seriously with this machine. But because it is big and powerful, and there's all this weight moving around, you really need to be careful with it. So, number one, never have any loose clothing around you that could possibly get into any part of what's going on with this mixer that you're near, because you're going to be putting ingredients into it. Number two, if you have long hair, never leave the hair draped down, all your hair up and back, so that you stay clear of the mixer. All of your clothing is clear of the mixer, and your hair is clear of the mixer, and your hands are clear of the mixer. Once you turn the mixer on, you're just going to be adding material through the top. So as the slop is turning inside the mixer, dry powder is now being added into the screen up here. And the screen kind of ensures that nothing bigger than those holes falls into the mixer. During the process of putting in the slop, there's no need for the lid to be down. You just put the slop directly into the mixer. Once all the slop is in, the lid comes down. Once the lid is down, you can turn the mixer on, and then it's time to start to add your dry materials. And there will be a recipe on the wall that will either be this one or something similar to it. And it will have the amount of clay, the different types of clay, and how you're going to make the clay. So in this case, we're looking at the studio stoneware, and there's two different categories here. One says from scratch, which means that you're not using slop or reclaim. You're just going to use fresh water. And then you would add 6 gallons of fresh water, and then add the appropriate weights of those clays. So the bags are in 50-pound increments. So you add a bag of ball clay, you add a bag of hawthorn, you add a bag of gold art, and you add a half of a bag of the feldspar. And then it says grog down there. Grog is a material that's added if you want the clay to have some kind of coarseness to it. If you want the clay to be smooth, you don't add grog. If you're making large sculpture, you may want quite a bit of grog. That'll be talked about later. This category here is where we're going to use the slop. So it's 10 gallons of slop. And then it's 8 scoops of the different materials. So in this case, it's 8 scoops of ball clay. And the scoop looks like this. So here's 2 scoops, and this is the one that we call a scoop. This is the large one. And when we say a scoop, you just dive it down into the bag and fill it up as much as possible, and that's 1 scoop. An important note about making clay is that the consistency has to be right. And this mixer is super good at taking wet clay, such as the reclaimed clay, and making it drier by adding powder. But what this mixer hates to do is to make clay that has gotten a little bit too stiff to make it wet again. So you always want to keep checking the clay to be sure that you've made it to the right consistency and not too stiff. Always remember that when you're testing the clay, that the clay is going to dry a little bit. It's going to get a little bit stiffer over the next 24 hours because that clay is continuing to absorb the available water. So always make the clay a little bit on the wet side of the consistency that you want to work with it at. Typically, when you make clay, ideally you would want to make it 24 hours in advance of you wanting to use any of it. Now this mixer makes a lot of clay. It can make up to 300 pounds of clay. And so it's usually best even if you're an advanced student, that you would be making it with a partner so that you will be able to split the amount of clay so that you each have 150 pounds. Then when that runs out, you can make clay again with your partner. But this way you divide the work between 2 people, the work and labor of making the clay, and you're not stuck with a huge amount of clay that could get too dried out before you have a chance to use it. So what you need to do here is turn the mixer to the on position. Now here, this giant fan is above the mixer come on, and it's going to be sucking air from the room or from outside of the doors open up into that fan so that most of the dust exits that way and doesn't go through. So you must be using the fan. Turning the fan off now because it's so loud. Now let's look at the mixer. The mixer is a concrete barrel inside of a steel frame, and that barrel rotates because there's a large sprocket with a chain on it down below here. There's the chain. And it's connected to a very powerful motor in the back. That's connected to a box that has an on and an off switch up here at the top. And you can't see those very well from your position in front of the mixer. The box is sort of turned away, and that's because of how it's set up with the lid safety. So I can't push any of the buttons on the mixer because if I do, it won't come on because the lid is open. So the first thing I have to do if I want to turn the mixer on is close the lid. The next thing I have to do is reach my hand around onto this box and feel the first button. The top button is the on button. Push that button. That turns the barrel and that begins to mix the clay. Now if I lift up the lid mixer turns off. Now, I've been using a mixer like this for 35 years, and they're in all kinds of schools all over the country. It's a Solner clay mixer, and I've never heard of anyone being hurt seriously with this machine. But because it is big and powerful, and there's all this weight moving around, you really need to be careful with it. So, number one, never have any loose clothing around you that could possibly get into any part of what's going on with this mixer that you're near, because you're going to be putting ingredients into it. Number two, if you have long hair, never leave the hair draped down, all your hair up and back, so that you stay clear of the mixer. All of your clothing is clear of the mixer, and your hair is clear of the mixer, and your hands are clear of the mixer. Once you turn the mixer on, you're just going to be adding material through the top. So as the slop is turning inside the mixer, dry powder is now being added into the screen that's made. And the screen kind of ensures that nothing bigger than a close falls into the mixer. During the process of putting in the slop, there's no need for the lid to be down. You just put the slop directly into the mixer. Once all the slop is in, the lid comes down. Once the lid is down, you can turn the mixer on, and then it's time to start to add your dry materials. And there will be a recipe on the wall that will either be this one or something similar to it. And it will have the amount of clay, the different types of clay, and how you're going to make the clay. So in this case, we're looking at the studio stoneware, and there's two different categories here. One says from scratch, which means that you're not using slop or reclaim. You're just going to use fresh water. And then you would add 6 gallons of fresh water, and then add the appropriate weights of those clays. So the bags are in 50-pound increments. So you add a bag of ball clay, you add a bag of hawthorn, you add a bag of gold art, and you add a half of a bag of the feldspar. And then it says grog down there. Grog is a material that's added if you want the clay to have some kind of coarseness to it. If you want the clay to be smooth, you don't add grog. If you're making large sculpture, you may want quite a bit of grog. That'll be talked about later. This category here is where we're going to use the slop. So it's 10 gallons of slop. And then it's 8 scoops of the different materials. So in this case, it's 8 scoops of ball clay. And the scoop looks like this. So here's 2 scoops, and this is the one that we call a scoop. This is the large one. And when we say a scoop, you just dive it down into the bag and fill it up as much as possible, and that's 1 scoop. An important note about making clay is that the consistency has to be right. And this mixer is super good at taking wet clay, such as the reclaimed clay, and making it drier by adding powder. But what this mixer hates to do is to make clay that has gotten a little bit too stiff to make it wet again. So you always want to keep checking the clay to be sure that you've made it to the right consistency and not too stiff. Always remember that when you're testing the clay, that the clay is going to dry a little bit. It's going to get a little bit stiffer over the next 24 hours because that clay is continuing to absorb the available water. So always make the clay a little bit on the wet side of the consistency that you want to work with it at. Typically, when you make clay, ideally you would want to make it 24 hours in advance of you wanting to use any of it. Now this mixer makes a lot of clay. It can make up to 300 pounds of clay. And so it's usually best if you're even if you're an advanced student, that you would be making it with a partner so that you will be able to split the amount of clay so that you each have 150 pounds. Then when that runs out, you can make clay again with your partner. But this way you divide the work between two people, the work and labor of making the clay, and you're not stuck with a huge amount of clay that could get too dried out before you have a chance to use it. Okay, as I continue the process of clay making, there's a few more things I want to explain. I've now put 10 gallons of slop in the mixer, and I'm introducing a new material. This is called red art. It's a red burning earthenware clay. It fires to a low temperature, and all of the other clays that in the room that was previously described are high fire clays. And for Ceramics 1, we are switching to a medium range clay, and there will be a recipe for Ceramics 1, and it will include a bag of this red art clay. The red art will be added as the dry material to the stoneware slop that came out of these two bins. This bin, I took one bucket out of here, and I found that there was a lot of grog in this clay that was very coarse. And then I noticed that in this barrel, the clay was a little bit smoother. And so I took 5 gallons out of here and 5 gallons out of the other barrel to get to a clay that's sort of medium coarse in terms of the slop. Now we're going to look at the slop in the mixer. So you can see it all just sitting there. And I'm going to turn the mixer on for a minute, and you'll see how the mixer distributes the clay a little bit. Lid down, on button. So there's an arrangement of bars inside of the kiln, and as the clay moves through those bars, it begins to mix it. Now, at the moment, there's so much water in there that the clay is just sitting and not really mixing. As I begin to add my first material, in this case the bag of red art, eventually it's going to start to mix, and I'll show you that when that happens. Okay, now the mixer, I've stopped the mixer so that you can see that I've added one bag of red art, and you can see that it's starting to change the color of the clay that's in there, and how the mixer is just turning it into a large donut. Whenever the clay looks like a large donut, and I'll turn the mixer on and you'll see it moving in a minute, you know that the clay is not close to being ready, so it's going to need a lot more dry material. And you just keep on moving down your list on the recipe. So now with this Cone 1, Ceramic 1 recipe I'm making, I'm going to start to add the other 3 clays that I talked about, which include the ball clay, the fire clay, and the gold art. And I'm just going to turn this on for a moment so you can see how the mixer is turning the clay right now. You can see that it's just a donut. It's not tumbling at all. Okay, we're back at the clay mixer, and I've just completed mixing a batch of Ceramic 1 clay. So all of the materials are in there, and while the mixer was mixing for about 10 minutes, once I was finished putting things in there, during that 10 minutes I cleaned up some of the mess that happened while I was making the clay, sweeping the floor and so on. Now the mixer has the batch of clay in it, and this is what it should look like when it's the right consistency in the mixer. I'm going to turn the mixer on briefly so you can see how the clay is moving in the mixer. This is a visual clue that you will need so that you don't have to open the lid every 5 seconds to check the consistency of the clay. So this is what it should look like when it's complete. Okay, I'm going to close the lid, turn it on, and this is how the clay is tumbling through the mixer. clay's passing through the steel bars and coming off in chunks, and it doesn't look like just a big donut. It looks a lot rougher than a smooth donut. So that's the right consistency. So I open the lid. I can grab the clay with my fingers and see, check the feel of it. I grab it, it's easy to manipulate, yet it's not sticking to my hand badly. If I let go of it, it'll fall. If I grab this clay and grab a hold of it and go like that and it doesn't come off, it's still too wet. If I think I missed that. If I grab it and it sticks in my hands and it won't come off of my fingers, it's going to be too wet. But I can push this pretty darn easily. And that's what I want. If the clay is too stiff, it's going to be impossible to work with, and it's really hard to make the clay soft again. And if I see you working with clay that's too hard, I'm going to make you bring it back to the mixer and soften it. And that's going to double your workload. So you always want to err towards the clay being on the soft side. Okay, once it's time to remove the clay from the mixer, the lid is open, and I found some type of a cart, and I have some kind of a bag. The bag has to be at least the size of a tall kitchen bag, the white tall kitchen bags that you buy at the store, or it could be the next size up in these black bags. You want to make the clay roll the size that you can still lift up from the floor. So if you can't lift a lot of weight off of the floor, then you want to make real small rolls. And I would suggest that you don't make them any larger than the one that I'm going to make now. So what's happened here is that I have this bag laying right near my body, and I'm making sure that where it opens is right there towards my body. It's not on the side, it's not over on the side, it's not in the back, it's right here. And what I'm going to do is build up a mass of clay here, a log of clay, and then I'm going to wrap that. And then it'll wrap the bag inside out and keep on wrapping around that log until it's completely, the bag is used up. And that way there'll be about 3 or 4 layers of plastic around the log of clay. And that will ensure that it lasts for a long time. But that's why you don't want to make tons of clay, because even clay that's wrapped in this manner, if it sits for a whole semester, it'll keep getting harder and harder, and pretty soon you won't be able to use it. So you have to, if you're going to store your clay, you must use this technique. So the next couple of sequences is going to show what that looks like. We turned it on and we're running. Okay, so in the previous sequence I talked about the plastic bag being set up right, and now I put a log of clay on the bag. You should never make logs larger than this, and again, if you can't pick this much clay off the floor, which many of you can't safely, then make it half this size and use a tall kitchen bag. Now I pulled all of this clay out of the front part of the mixer. In the previous sequence you saw what it looked like with the whole batch in there. Now down in here you could see where I removed the clay. So what I'm going to do now is close the lid. There's not that much more clay for me to get right there, so I'm going to just turn the mixer on for a second, and it's going to reposition the clay so now I can get to it easily again. Okay? So the way that it works with bagging, this log, as I turn the log, the first layer of plastic, the first edge of the bag, follows and sticks to the log. The other layer, this back layer, trails behind. So as I turn it, I now move to the bottom of the bag. This log continues to roll, and the bag begins to turn itself inside out almost magically. And as I keep pulling the plastic forward and around it, now I have a tightly bagged log of clay that's not going to let any air in there, and there's many layers of plastic over that piece of clay. Because air is the enemy of your clay storage. Any air that gets to it, it's just going to start to dry it out there, and in no time the clay won't be usable. You would have to recycle it and begin to mix clay again. So you want to protect this because you have a lot of labor into it. You want to do it right. You make it too hard, and myself or Andrew, whoever's teaching you, will make you go back to the mixer and make the clay softer. So be sure that you get the consistency right. So now I'll just continue with another bag and then another bag, and it might take 4 or 5 bags this size to get all the clay out of this mixer. That's it. Okay, here we are back at the mixer. Here's my load of clay. I've got 4 full bags, and now we need to look at how the mixer gets cleaned out. Now I've taken a scraper tool and scraped the clay off the walls of the mixer most of the way around. So here's an area where I didn't scrape it yet. That needs to be scraped down. And all those scrapings amount to this much clay there. That's about 25 pounds of clay there. So that's all good clay that it's built up on the sides. And I'm feeling it to make sure that it's okay. If I found that it was inconsistent or not mixed well, then it would go back into the slop barrel. Now the clay that remains on the floor of the mixer, I'm going to scrape it out also. And I know that that clay is not going to be consistent. It's going to have hard stuff and soft stuff, and I'm not going to put that into the clay that I'm going to use. It's going to be put into the slop. And then it'll just go back into the mixer and become clay again when the next person mixes clay. So again, this is the clay from the sidewall that I'm going to use to make pots with or sculpture with. And then the floor of the mixer looks like that. I have to scrape the entire thing out so that there's no massive amounts of clay, and turn the barrel and rotate it so I can get to all places on the barrel. And once it's all cleaned out really well, then I have to take some water and a big sponge and sponge it down and sponge off all of the steel parts so that it's ready for the next person to use. Now, a helpful hint, the actual cleanup of the mixer takes almost as long as making the clay. So if you make clay in groups, in other words, somebody starts at 10 in the morning, they make a batch from 10 until 11, then your friend comes in and makes clay with their friend from 11 till 12. And then from 12 to 1, somebody else makes clay, and it's all the same kind of clay. If you do it with that kind of efficiency, then the mixer only needs cleaned one time. Sponged down and cleaned one time. It needs scraped each time, but it doesn't need sponged each time, as long as somebody's going directly back into the mixer with the same kind of clay. If you're making porcelain, then you'll need to re-sponge the mixer because likely we'll have it will not be perfectly clean, and you will need to make it perfectly clean so that you do not contaminate your white porcelain. If you're making stoneware, or you're making the red art clay body, the Cone 1 Ceramic 1 clay body, the mixer does not have to be perfectly clean. If there is any dried clay in the mixer when you go to use it, what you can do is scrape it all to the bottom, to the floor, and then take some water and pour it over those scrapings, and within about 5 minutes that will slake down into mud, and then you're safe to put your either clean water in or your reclaim in. But you don't want to have a dirty mixer and throw the reclaim in, because those chunks of dry clay will not get soft, and they will be distributed throughout your entire batch of clay and ruin all of your work. So you have to start with a clean mixer where there's no dried out clay. If there's wet clay in the mixer, that's fine, but there cannot be dried out chunks of clay in the mixer. Hello everyone. This is a very short video. It's one of the first videos you'll see of the Ceramic 1 Intermediate or Advanced class, but particularly Ceramics 1. And this has to do with the tools that you're going to need for this course to succeed in it. And I would expect that you're going to try to get these tools as fast as you can from the time you see this video going forward. I'm going to send the video out before school starts, and the first day of class is on a Wednesday. By the following Monday, I would hope that you would have all these tools. These are things that you're going to need to get. And I'm going to start over here. There's a list on the board here that you can refer to. You will always need, and you'll need this for all of your art classes, you're going to need some kind of a notebook. And if you have a notebook that's specific for ceramics, that's great. But if it's just a notebook that you're using for other classes, that's okay too. But you're going to need to keep notes when there's going to be a lecture, and that could happen on any given day at any time. And so you always have to have that available to you. It should be in your locker or where you're working. You need something to write with every single class, because what good is a notebook if you can't write? Because of COVID, you're going to be walking around campus wearing a mask. By the way, my name is John Balistreri. I am the professor here in the ceramic program. I'm the head of the ceramic program. I have a colleague that works here with me, Andrew Gilliott, and you should always come to one of us if you need something. And so yeah, this is Bowling Green State University Ceramics in the middle of COVID. So this is for the fall of 2020, and you're all going to be walking around wearing these masks that are protecting you from COVID, something like this. You will not be allowed in the studio with a bandana or a fleece or one of those neck scrunchy things that you just put up over your face. It has to be a mask that's made to deter the virus. Those things do not work. So this kind of a cheapo mask is fine, and masks that people are making on the internet, most of those are made in a way that's consistent with this type of mask. During this course, we will have masks available because maybe your mask will fail, maybe the strap will break, and we'll give you a new mask. But you can't come into this room without a mask. Some of the ceramic processes, like making clay or making glaze, it's best if you have an N95 mask. And that mask this is a fancy one made by RZ Company. This is the kind of thing that healthcare workers use, and it filters out much more material than this mask does. This one I like it because it fits tight around my face. It has a filter inside of it. Velcro, goes on and off really easily, simple to use. But you're gonna also get an N95 mask. They haven't showed up yet, but they've told me that they've sourced them, and every ceramic student is gonna get an N95 mask, your own mask. And that's for COVID, but it's also for protecting yourself against silicosis and clay particles. So the tiniest clay particles are basically the same size as the COVID virus, super, super tiny. And if you ingest those particles for a long time over your lifetime, they can cause different sorts of problems like silicosis and other kinds of health risks. Here's the main thing that you gotta get. It's the pottery toolkit. There's different kinds of these toolkits. They all have the same basic things in them. They all basically look like this. There's a place downtown called the Art Depot, downtown Bowling Green. And right now you could go into the Art Depot with a mask on, pick one of these up, as well as some of these other tools I'm going to show you. Or you can order from them online and then they'll bring it out to your car. Or you can source any of these things on the internet, your choice. But shipping, by the time it gets shipped to you, how long is that going to take? And if you need to express ship it, it could take longer to ship it than when I'm requiring you to have your toolkit. So the easiest way is to just get it downtown. Places like Michael's has this, places like Hobby Lobby will have this, but the Art Depot downtown should have enough for all of our students. The first thing you're going to do when you get this thing is get rid of all of the plastic, because the last thing in the world that you're going to want to do after you use this toolkit is to try to put them into this ridiculous piece of plastic. This is a display thing that makes it easy for them to hang it up on a shelf somewhere for people to see what's in there. But other than that, it's completely useless. So one of the first things that you're going to do is get another item that's in your toolkit or on your tool list, and that's a scissors, and cut all these tools out of here and then get rid of the plastic. just a complete waste of time. So as I'm doing that, I'm going to identify these different tools. So this is a throwing sponge or a small sponge. You're going to need this for sure. This is a wooden throwing rib, and you're going to need that for hand building and throwing. It's called a rib, and it has a particular kind of shape to it that is useful and important. The next tool I'm going to pull out of here is a trimming tool or a loop tool, a loop trimming tool. This is one of the most important tools that you'll use when you're trimming pottery off the potter's wheel, but it's also really handy when you're hand building. It's when you use it to scrape away and so on. In another video, I'm going to show these tools in action a little bit. The next one is a more fine-tuned trimming tool, which is something I almost never use. It tends to just make a bunch of marks that I don't care for. But sometimes you have to get into some little corner or something, and some of my students will use this tool quite a bit, but not my favorite. Also a trimming tool. The next tool that you'll definitely need and is very handy to have is called a needle tool. And that's because it's got a sort of needle point on the end of it. And it comes in really handy for a number of things, and so that's a part of that toolkit. And this is a throwing stick or an undercut stick, and it's also one of the most important tools in the kit, and you will use it to help finish the bottom of pots on the wheel before you take them off the wheel, and it comes in handy for all sorts of things, and so you always want to have this tool. If you lose any of these tools, you're going to want to replace them, and they're sold individually. But on a certain day when you're throwing pottery and I ask you where's your undercut tool or your wood modeling tool, this tool, and you don't have it, I'm not going to be thinking very much of you because you need this tool to do certain things. And if you've lost it and it's the second time I've asked you where it is and you don't have this tool, it's a big problem. So whenever you're missing a tool, you're going to have to get it back. And once you have all these tools out of this junk plastic here, you're going to write your name on every single one of them on the first day of class. This is a metal rib. It's used for doing certain kinds of smoothing. So you have a wooden rib here, you have a metal rib here. And they're used in two different ways. Both of them are necessary. This little thing here is called a wire tool, and that's basically what it is. And you got to be kind of careful when you try to unwrap the wire. It's bound up in a certain way, and you want to be sure you unwind it in a pretty careful, controlled way, because if it kinks on you, that kink will never go away, and I don't want it to be kinked. So now it's ready to be used, and this just cuts through clay. So if you want to cut a pot off the wheel, you just pass this through and then you lift the pot off the wheel. If you're taking a small piece of clay off of a big chunk of clay, this wire just cuts through it, sort of like those wires they use for cheese, but much more effective. So that's the basic throwing kit, and then this goes in the trash. You need all of those. There's other things that you're going to need, maybe not on the first day, but soon after school starts. You're going to need a variety of brushes, and many of you will have brushes that are used for oil painting or watercolors or whatever. These are the kind of brushes that work good. These are some smaller sizes that are used for sumi ink, and they happen to hold ceramic material really well. It pulls the ceramic material up, and then you can disperse it with make a fine line. And the smaller the brush, the finer the line. And there you get much smaller than this, to where there's just a few hairs. And they get much bigger. And this is a handmade brush that somebody made, and it has a beaver tail, and it spins around and comes to a very fine tip, so I can do very fine detail work with certain materials using this brush. You won't be able to buy this, but you'll want a small one of these and a larger one of these Sumi brushes. And if you like doing really detailed work, you might want a really fine brush. If you do have painting brushes, one of them that works really good is like a number 6 or number 8 long sable. That's a good brush that'll do some fine work in a good way. And then there's these hake brushes. So this brush works really well. It's H-A-K-E, and these are the same thing, and you'll find these in different widths. And this is an individual one that was just pulled off of one of these larger brushes. Here's one that has 3, and so they just get progressively wider or narrower depending on what you need. And these hold the ceramic material extremely well, so you can apply it to your pieces. So these are the kind of brushes you might want to find. You're going to need a towel or two, and you'll be putting your name on your brushes, your tools, and your towel. Because of COVID, we're not going to have towels floating around without names on them that different people are handling. This is all going to be part of your kit, and it's going to go into your locker, and your name is going to be on this stuff, and other people aren't going to be touching it. So that includes your towel. And while we're on to the towel thing, you know, clay is basically mud, and you're going to get dirty in this class. So don't come to this class wearing a bunch of fancy clothes or high heels or anything like that. And when it comes to shoes, don't come with open-toe shoes, because we move around bricks. If you drop a big heavy brick on your toe, it's not going to be very nice in a flip-flop. And flip-flops slide around, your foot comes out of the flip-flop. You're going to receive a safety document, and it's going to talk about things like sandals and flip-flops. But you need to wear the appropriate clothing and the appropriate footwear. And when it's really warm outside, everybody wants to just walk around in flip-flops or sandals. And that's not okay in this class. So you'll need your own towel. This is a good size. It could be a bath towel, but not a beach towel. That gets a little bit too big. But just something like this that you can then wash out and clean and keep in your locker. You need some kind of a blade, some kind of a knife, and this is the best kind, and you'll find it at the same store that this other tools come in. It's called a fettling knife, and for some reason these fettling knives cut clay in a really good way compared to, let's say, a paring knife or a butter knife. Those types of knives just don't work quite as good as a fettling knife. And it would just be a part of your toolkit. The toolkit doesn't come with it. You'd have to buy the fettling knife separate. If you want to bring a butter knife or some cheap paring knife, you can. But you can buy one of these. They're not that expensive. There's a thing that you need to scratch the surface of the clay with, and the thing that I found that works the very best is a fork. And if you bring in a really cheap fork, I'll take a pliers and separate the tines on the fork a little bit, and that'll make it easy for you to scratch and score clay when you're trying to attach pieces of clay together. They make a steel rib that looks like this, except for it's serrated. You can buy that too, and it's going to be more expensive than a cheap fork, and it's not going to work quite as good. But you can buy a serrated rib, so that would be okay if you want to do that. It'll be sold separately, just like the fettling knife would. So you're going to want this one. The other good thing to have is a spray bottle. Probably the smaller the better, because you got to store all this in your locker, so don't get one bigger than this. You can, at the hardware store or somewhere like Ben Franklin's, they're going to have really small squirt bottles probably. And then you're going to put your name on it, and you're also going to say what's in it, which is going to be water only. So if there's any of these spray bottles, it needs to have your name on it, and it needs to say water or H2O or both. Okay, now we're going to move into the thing where we're going to provide you. So normally you you would have to bring your own bucket, but because of COVID, we're sort of standardizing some things. And so you're all gonna be getting a bucket that looks like this, and you're gonna be using this tape to put on the side of the bucket that's gonna have your name on it. And we're gonna be giving you a black magic marker to label all of this stuff with your name. And you're gonna be given one of these big sponges that helps you clean up things really fast. This is gonna be given to you. You're also gonna, the studio is gonna supply students with bags, plastic bags. Plastic bags are super important for different reasons. If you're working with clay and you leave it exposed, it's gonna dry out, and the air in the room is gonna dry it out, and you won't be able to continue to work on it. And part of the reason that you need a scissors is because these bags are used in a few different ways. One way is that you're gonna wanna open up the bag and use that to cover pieces you make. And another way that you're gonna wanna use the bag is you're gonna cut it with the scissors. And you also might have a ball of clay or something that you wanna keep for some reason, and then you can keep it wrapped up in one of these bags so it stays the same until you come back the next time. When you're building, sometimes it's really helpful to have strips of clay. You'll need these strips of clay, strips of plastic to cover up edges of clay. So you can cut the bag in such a way that you now have a strip, and then that strip can conform to the edge of the clay and wrap that up tight. Because the edge of the clay is always going to try to dry out faster than the lower part of the clay. And so you need to control drying through this entire class. If you don't figure out how clay dries in Ceramics 1, you're not going to be getting an A in ceramics, I guarantee you that. The evaporation of water from this ball of soft clay is what it's all about. I mean, it's a physics thing that happens, and if you're not in charge of that, that means that nature's going to take its course. You're going to come back and things are going to be too hard, and a piece that you've worked on for a week, you can't add more clay, it would just crack off. And so you have to control drying, and that's what bags are used for. And I like to get these bags that are called painters drop cloth bags that are less than 1 mil in thickness, like 0.5 or 0.75 or 1 mil in thickness. And they come in these rolls that are kind of like logs. And then if you cut one of these logs off, you would get this at the hardware store, Home Depot, places like that. Now all of a sudden you have 9 feet of these strips that you can now use to wrap edges of your pieces. And depending on how complex the piece is, you might need more of these things. So all of this stuff will go into your bucket. Everything that I've shown you will just get picked up at the end of the day, thrown into your bucket. I mean, if you have an N95 mask, that could go in there too. Your towel can go into the bucket. Things that you write with can go in there. And your notebook can fit right beside your bucket in the locker that you have. And these buckets are made to fit into the lockers. So the whole thing is like this, and you bring it out when it's ceramics time, whether it's during class or when you want to come in outside of class and work, and you have everything there. And you will need to have those things. There's specialty things like I was talking about ribs. Well, here's an example of some more expensive plastic ribs, and some are real soft, some are real stiff, and in between, and there are different shapes. And so there's different kinds of things that you could buy in addition to this basic kit. But I've been working for a long time in ceramics. I've built humongous things that weigh thousands of pounds, and what's in this bucket right here will pretty much get you through. Definitely through Ceramics 1 and beyond that. So there's the tools. Here's the tool list. Get all of this stuff as soon as possible. Bring it the first day if you can, and definitely have it by the second day, because you're going to be working with clay right off the bat. especially in this shortened semester that we have. There's one other thing that I did not mention is that you have a locker, you'll need to bring your own lock. So it's just a standard locker that looks like any other school locker you've had in high school or wherever. And a master lock with a key or with a combination will lock your locker up and secure your stuff, which you'll also be putting your name on. So you also need a lock, and I'll write that down right here. Lock. And now that we're at the end of this video that lasted longer than I had hoped, this is the stuff that you need to get. And the bucket and the big sponge and the plastic bags are stuff we're going to give you when you get here. So welcome to ceramics, and more videos will follow, and I'll be meeting all of you soon. Good luck.